So we all know that size matters, right guys? Especially when it comes to the length of polearms. So why is it that bigger isn't always better, and polearms throughout history, whether we're talking about Japanese yari and naginata or European poleaxes, halberds and partisans, come in such a variety of sizes? Some pikes and lances are incredibly long, while some spears are actually really short. So why isn't bigger always better? Let's have a look at why polearms come in such a massive variety of sizes. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, you should know that polearms are just about one of the most important weapons, probably along with bows, throughout human history, and they come in a huge variety of sizes, from really long lances and pikes through to relatively shorter types of poleaxes, halberds, bills, and even some quite short spears. So what we're going to look at here is the surprisingly complex topic of why they come in such a variety of sizes, and I promise you, it's not as simple as you probably thought. So first up, we have to acknowledge that some of the limitations of how big a polearm can be is down to the human being. For a start, are you going to be using this in two hands or in one hand? And very clearly you can handle a much bigger weapon in two hands than you can handle in one. And some of this comes down to tactical application. Are you going to be on foot? Are you going to be mounted? Are you going to be with a shield? So clearly if you're using a shield, that introduces a whole bunch of other tactical considerations, especially if you're expecting your opponents to have shields, which might mean that you choose to have a shorter polearm. We'll come back to this point later. But equally, if you're on horseback, you can actually handle a pretty long pole weapon, and not only might it be held in one hand, but potentially, and sometimes, for example, with certain types of Roman or even Persian or Indian cavalry, they sometimes use the pole weapon in two hands. So two-handed and one-handed isn't only a limitation of on foot or horse, but clearly if you are on horseback with a one-handed lance, say with a shield for example, there is a maximum size of lance that you can use. But once again, bigger isn't always better, and there are advantages to having shorter or lighter lances. We'll come back to this in a minute. So let's start off specifically with pikes. Why was it that pikes were so long, and was always having the longest pike an advantage? Well, fundamentally, if we've got one army which is equipped with, let's say, 14-foot pikes, and another army comes along with 20-foot pikes, and the general consensus and kind of common sense would make you think that yes, they have a reach advantage, right? Well, yes, they do have a reach advantage, but reach isn't absolutely everything. Bear in mind that sometimes things like armor and shields can sometimes negate the reach advantage, because it means that you can close in beyond a certain range. And it does mean that if you've got longer pikes, at the point at which your enemy closes in beyond the point of those pikes, they're now going to be at stabbing distance and within the range of your pikes. But hold on, there's another factor here. Because the pikemen rather, are in ranks, okay, so that means that every pike is going to be coming forwards over the shoulders or heads of the people in front. And that does mean that the longer your pike is, the more ranks you can reach past, which means more points come into contact with the enemy. So generally speaking, when we're dealing with pike block versus pike block, or phalanx versus phalanx, the side with the longer pikes very often does have an advantage, not just of reach, but also of number of points which can be engaged because of the number of ranks which can reach past. Now, believe it or not, this advantage was still recognised even in the industrial age of gunpowder, where there were ranks of people with musket and bayonet. In that case, a person with a spadroon could outreach the person with a musket and a bayonet. Moreover, if you were a sergeant with one of these spontoons, for example, you could reach over the shoulders of the people in front of you and still bring your spontoon to bear at a distance whereby you still had a rank of muskets and bayonets in front of you. Now, coming back to the very long pike and indeed the lance, in the 17th century we actually see a contest between these two things, whereby particularly people who were famous for using the lance, like the Polish lancers for example, actually started using such long lances that the idea was to try and outreach the people holding a pike. So obviously the pikes got longer, and the cavalry, in order to still try and be relevant against those, I mean they had pistols and they had firearms as well, but in terms of their hand weapons, started using longer and longer lances with weights at the back. Essentially that's where this comes from, so that they could hold it further towards the rear and reach further. So we do see a sort of arms race in the length of pikes and the length of lances at various points in history, but perhaps most famously in the 17th century. So in that case, that's why we get longer and longer lances and pikes, because they're trying to outreach each other. But was it always an advantage having a longer pike? Well, there are some disadvantages to having a longer pike. First of all, a longer pike is more difficult to manage and heavier. Obviously, the longer it is, the heavier it gets. But equally, if it is longer, then you're going to have problems, for example, if you're going through woodland or perhaps even in urban areas, and just manoeuvring it around becomes harder. Also, something else which often gets overlooked is the longer the pike gets, the floppier it gets, and to counter-effect the fact that you get this sag in the pike shaft, you either have to taper it or you have to make it thicker and yet again heavier. So a bigger, heavier pike is more difficult and slower and more cumbersome to manage. Moreover, those of you who understand the leverage used in fencing, strong, medium and weak on a blade, we have the same thing on a pike shaft here. This is the weak, this is the medium, this is the strong. You essentially, if you have a longer pole, have a longer degree of weak. So a person with a shorter pike is able to push your point aside and come in and stab behind, because you have such a long and unwieldy, in some cases even floppy, weapon. So a shorter spear or shorter pike can sometimes not only be quicker, lighter, more manoeuvrable, easier to deploy and move around, but also in the bind, that is where the two things are against each other, pushing against each other, can also have greater leverage. So just before we move away from pikes, we need to recognise that pike drill, particularly of the 17th century, was very formulated, because to manage these enormous pikes effectively on the battlefield, you had to be able to train your soldiers to march and manoeuvre and turn these massive weapons so that they could be effective. So you would bring the thing to bear in this direction. If you suddenly got charged by cavalry over there, you couldn't just have everybody suddenly turn their pikes, because they would all get stuck together and kind of tangled essentially and hitting each other around the back of the head. So what you have to do is you have to train your pikemen to bring the pikes up, present a new direction to the pike block, and then bring the pikes down to bear on that side. So there's a certain degree of coordination that has to happen for these very long weapons to work. And bear in mind that the pike is essentially only a thrusting weapon. It can bind and it can defend, and in fact we do see one-on-one dueling tournament use of the pike occasionally, but it can defend, but fundamentally it's only a thrusting weapon. It's not something that you can easily turn around and hit with, certainly not if there's anybody standing next to you. So that's when we come to weapons like this spontoon, which is a later derivative really of the partisan. Now the partisan is not only a thrusting spear, but much like the earlier winged spear, is something that you can move around with both ends and turn freely and use the edge. So it's not just a thrusting weapon, but it is also a hitting and cutting weapon as well. And that means necessarily that it has to be shorter than the pike for you to be able to do that, for you to be able to turn it around without it hitting the ground, or indeed people standing quite some distance away from you. And the more multi-role a weapon becomes, like this poleaxe, or indeed something like a halberd or a bill, the more that the weapon needs to be able to turn in order to function, to give blows or hooking and pushing and pulling and all of these kinds of things. The weapon can only be a certain length. It can't be anything like as long as a pike, or indeed as long as most spears were in earlier periods, because the weapon has to be able to turn around easily, and therefore it can only really be a maximum usually of about 8 foot long. So in fact what we see is things like partisans and certain types of bill, glaives, things like this, really usually only reach a maximum of about 8, sometimes 9, but usually about 8 or 9 feet long maximum. And poleaxes and certain types of glaive as well are very often only 5 or 6 feet long. If we look at the period treatises and sources, this often equates, if we're we're not going to use literal measurements, to about the height of your shoulder or face for the main head of the weapon here, and with the tip usually to the top of the head, sometimes a bit above that. So if we look in most period art, poleaxes are usually not much above head height, and very often they're below head height. Just put the poleaxe down for a second. When we come to things like the spontoon here, or partisan, or even quarterstaffs, usually the measure is about to where you can reach the top of your hand, and lo and behold, that's exactly where I can reach to on this 18th century spontoon. That is about the maximum reach of quarterstaffs, partisans, bills, things like this, which you can comfortably rotate and move around without them becoming too cumbersome and hitting the ground too often. And it's not even just a situation of hitting the ground and physically being able to move these things, it's also a question of timing as well, because any weapon that is longer than this starts to become so slow to rotate, and again I use the word cumbersome, probably overusing it, but it becomes so obvious and clear to rotate that it's really very easy to avoid, whereas a weapon of approximately as far as you can reach with your hand above your head is a weapon which can still rotate at a reasonable speed, and therefore it can parry, it can bind, it can cut, it can hit, it can hook, and do all of these things that you want these sorts of weapons to do. Now I know at this point some people will ask me, Matt, why is the poleaxe shorter than the halberd, or usually than the bill as well? And I think my general answer would be that there are certain weapons like the poleaxe which were a little bit more catered towards single combat. This is more of a knightly weapon. The kind of rank and file version is the halberd. Now if you are in a body of troops, in a block of troops, then you're not usually going to be turning the weapon around as much as this as you might do with a poleaxe, using both ends liberally, as we see in the poleaxe treatises used in single combat. Instead you're largely going to be holding the weapon more towards the back end, and yeah, you'll occasionally do things up here with the back end, but you have to be above the level of the heads of your fellows either side of you and behind you. So in other words, halberds and bills have to operate in groups. They can't wildly swing around like this, because you're going to be hitting the people next to you, and equally if I'm stabbing someone with the back end of the poleaxe here, I don't want to be jabbing that end of my poleaxe towards the person standing behind me. So these knightly weapons, and for the people who are fighting in full harness, really as kind of captains or knights, these weapons are better suited to them fighting probably with a bit more space around them, or acting as commanders of units, whereas people who are all squished in using, let's say, partisans or halberds or bills are more likely to have nothing at the back end except for wooden shaft, and they're predominantly just using one end of the weapon most of the time, or at least more of the time. And of course, that being the case, they can afford to have a longer weapon with more of it held out in front, and that also gives them better reach advantages against cavalry and against enemy polearms such as pikes. So in other words, their weapon is held more forward more of the time, and turned around and held in the middle less. You could liken it a little bit to the difference between the sort of quarterstaffing we see in Robin Hood films, where the weapon's held more in the middle more of the time, versus the quarterstaff we actually see in treatises, where it's held more towards the back, I think. Now, that being said, there are some common techniques, and if we look at the anonymous Bolognese source, which has a section on the use of the bill, the techniques are very similar to the poleaxe. So it's not a huge black and white difference, it's more of a spectrum, more of a grayscale, and I think that these poleaxes, the shorter poleaxes, are more at one end of the spectrum, and things like bills and halberds are more at the middle part of the spectrum. But I think there's no question that there is a difference in polearm lengths we see when we're considering battlefield massed formation weapons versus single combat kind of knightly dueling weapons. And of course we have to concede that armour plays a part in this as well, because if you're wearing full plate harness, you can sort of wade in and get in close, and you're going to have a big advantage at that distance, whereas if you're more lightly equipped, just with a helmet and a brigandine and a mail shirt, you're probably going to want to keep further away from those fully armoured people, so you're going to use a longer weapon and not get in so close and personal with them if you can avoid it. So the penultimate point is connected to that last one, and it can come down to role as well. Are the polearms that you're equipping your troops with, or equipping yourself with in some cases, are they for battlefield formations? Are they for large blocks like pike blocks or halberd blocks, or are they for skirmishing and raiding? And we talked about this when we talk about the Danish great axe, for example, from the sort of late Viking and Norman eras. There might be a length that you choose because you want to be highly mobile, going into buildings, in streets or into forests and stuff like this, and that is going to dictate what kind of weapon you choose and how you're fighting, whether you're fighting in a large formation or fighting more as individuals. Okay, so the last point we're going to consider and mention here, and if you can think of other points at this point, get posting down below, because this is the last point. So is there something I haven't covered yet? I'm sure that there's a couple of things I've probably forgotten for this video. This is just a quick summary. Environment, so where you are fighting, what materials are available to you. So for example, if you're living in a place where you don't have the sort of trees that produce long poles, or in this case bamboo, that produce long poles for long pikes, you're probably not going to use really long pikes because those aren't things that are available to you. But equally, are you fighting in a wooded area, a desert area, a swampy area? And all of these things affect what type of weapon you choose to use, what type of lay of the land you use. So do you use the woodland? Do you use the marshes? Do you use the hills or mountains? And whether we're looking at Switzerland or certain bits of England or Spain, for example, or North Africa, then that's going to dictate what kind of weapons you choose, not just pole weapons, but all weapons, and of course horses and other forms of transport. So all of those things will contribute to the nature of the polearms you use and how you use them. But additionally, I want you to think about a very important part of warfare, which my friend Drakinophil obviously considers a lot, but which I probably don't consider enough: naval warfare. Now, on board ships, we did have something called a boarding pike, and that was somewhat similar to this cavalry lance here. And the boarding pikes were used very specifically on the decks of the ships to repel boarders, to keep boarders away, primarily. They could be used in offence, but I think they were mostly used in defence. However, there are other weapons used on board ships, like if we look at the Mary Rose, we see bills, cutting and thrusting bills, but they may have been quite short. They might not have been particularly long, so that they could be used more deftly on board ship. In a similar way to some of the swords, for example, cutlasses tend to be shorter to make them easier to use on board ships. So, whether we're fighting in fortifications, in towns, in woodland or jungle or on board ships, all of these things would dictate partially the size of our polearms. So whether we're talking about massive 20-foot long pikes, whether we're talking about these sort of medium length things like partisans and glaives and winged spears, slightly shorter pole axes and two-handed axes, or even quite diminutive little spears used with large shields like these, or indeed, you know, any type of weapon used with a shield, which the shield dictates the nature of things, and also armour changes the nature of things as well. The way that they're fought with, what type of formations, whether it's skirmishing, whether it's big set-piece battles, or whether you're fighting on ships or in any kind of strange environment. All of these things dictate how weapons were used, and indeed they could be used wildly differently. And just because something looks like a spear, just changing its length can drastically change how you would want to use it as a weapon. For example, do you just use the pointy end, or do you use both ends? Do you have two pointy ends? All of these things. So changing the length can make a huge difference to what the weapon's used for and how it's used. Anyway, I hope that's been somewhat thought-provoking. If you can think of other points that I haven't covered here, of course, you're very welcome to post them down below. Please check that you're subscribed to the channel, because it makes a huge difference to me and how the channel grows and who gets to see it. I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, continue to be, hopefully anyway, for the next video. And for now, over and out. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.